So let's look at sort of first principles of sanitation planning, right? In a world, traditionally, what we would do is we would start with a baseline analysis, a study that's a reasonably representative analysis of what's happening within the city. And often this starts with an assessment of the different infrastructure components. That's traditionally what's done. Then you would do a gap analysis, and then you would do you would say, based on the gaps, this is the strategy or the action plan or a response. That is a macro plan. And, again, different cities have different terminologies. It could be, some of us call it city sanitation planning, some of it call it sanitation master plans. So again, this can vary widely in terms of what it covers. That then inspires a set of very specific projects or investments that we want to make, for which we could do a feasibility report or a detailed project report, depending on the context, depending on how much we know and how much additional technical and financial planning we need to do, which then goes into procurement and implementation, into the procurement and implementation phase. But in the real world, not all of us go through all of these steps, right? And I'm pretty sure most of you have experienced this as well. In one scenario, you see we just do a baseline, a gap. There really isn't a macro plan at all. And in a way, the inspiration to even do a baseline or a gap analysis could simply be because you want to justify a set of infrastructure projects. So you already know the kinds of investments that you're interested in making, and you're somehow kind of finding a way to retrofit that within the city context, and you jump into a set of projects directly without setting a strategy or a roadmap for the city. And this is not uncommon. And I'm sure several of you here have also experienced this. There is another situation that's actually even less desirable, because they don't even take the effort to make the case. And we see this, for example, in countries where still the planning and the investments are very top down. So let's say a particular government wants to basically invest in public toilets. So they will just say, okay, I'm going to have a viability grant window, and all cities can access this to build projects, and everybody submits proposals for projects to do public toilets or to build fecal sludge treatment plants. And there is no real context to how this fits in with the realities of the city at all. So when we talk about sanitation planning, I think the limited point that we wanted to communicate with this slide is, often we don't really even go through all of the steps of the planning process well. Even in the best case scenario, when we go through all of these steps, we go do a baseline, we do a gap analysis and develop a strategy or a macro plan or a roadmap, what do we really see? And one of the things that we did at Athena early on was to really look at a whole bunch of city sanitation plans, right? And really good ones that were being developed in Asia and in Africa. And we started unpacking what these plans have or what they contain. They all obviously start with some general characteristics of what's happening in the city. They cover some sort of a summary of what's happening in terms of infrastructure, in terms of water supply, toilets, solid waste management, and wastewater and used water. And they do a basic assessment saying, okay, this is the institutional framework, and this is the total available money, this is the budgets of the city government or the utility, this is the sort of operating cash flows, and this is what it can allow. Sounds like a pretty good baseline, doesn't it? And they often then do a gap analysis or a SWOT analysis on this baseline, and they come up with a strategy. Their strategies, and I would encourage those of you who are interested to actually go out and pick out, and I'm happy to share some good examples of these sanitation plans as well, the good ones actually. You would see something very similar. They all have a set of infrastructure targets, and the strategy talks about how those infrastructure targets will be achieved. They talk about what technology options are suitable and how to finance it, how to build capacities to support those options, and also how to raise monies in a manner that can help sustainably finance those technology options. Now, this looks like a good plan, right? But are we really missing anything? And I think the the answer to that question really is also what inspired citywide inclusive sanitation, or the principles around citywide inclusive sanitation in the first place. And the first thing is that even in a very good plan, equity is often missing or is an afterthought. What does that mean? There is no clear analysis or articulation of how the needs or the challenges of the poor or the low-income households are different from the general population, or how the investments are going to benefit the poor. There is no articulation of it at all, or in the instances where it is covered as a notional afterthought. There is no systematic analysis that looks at low-income households well. Infrastructure is often the primary lever or the primary input that we use to think about our plans. And you, as I go to the next slides, and I mean, maybe all of you are thinking, what else, like if you have to improve sanitation, you have to invest in infrastructure. Yes, that's true, but that's not probably the only way in which, or need necessarily the only way in which one can develop or improve the quality or coverage of services. There are other levers, and our imagination and the possibilities often in the way our sanitation plans are defined is just limited to looking at infrastructure upgrades and improvements. And we'll talk about what else is out there. But we see that we're so focused on infrastructure and saying, let's make these investments, and everything else is linked only to that investment, which means any regulation, institutional environment, institutional capacities are all supposed to simply be secondary enabling conditions to support certain infrastructure investments. They're not seen as independent levers unto themselves, and we don't explore the possibilities within those baskets. There is seldom any discussion around service quality, right? We talk about X percentage households have access to emptying. What is the quality of service that is being provided today? How do we define emptying quality? Or what is the quality of treatment that is being achieved by our wastewater treatment plants and fecal sludge treatment plants? There seldom is discussion around that. And there is seldom thinking about whether our current investments will actually improve quality of services. Most importantly, we don't talk about how these investments will impact the overall health of the utility and affect the utility's ability to make investments in the future, and what the value for money from these proposed investments are. And what I mean by value for money is, if I'm going to be borrowing $100 million, I want to make sure that $100 million actually, I can use it in a way where I can benefit the most number of people, rather than concentrate it on a smaller subsegment. And these are all often missing in traditional sanitation planning processes. And this is what we want to try and change. I'll pause here for a second, and I don't know if there are any remarks or clarificatory questions, and if you have, I'm happy to take that here before I go to the next slide. Does this resonate with your experience, or do you feel differently? Feel free, like this is a totally, like, I know it's being recorded, but I'm sure it's a conversation. So does anybody have any comments or remarks before I proceed?
Dr. Najiba has raised his hand.
Oh yeah, sorry, please go ahead. I can't see because yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. I just wanted to comment on two things. So one, quality of service. So I think one of the challenges I realized when practicing this was the indicators for quality of service are normally non-existent. So to measure the quality. And secondly, the data to collect this data on quality So people just visit households and check around. Do they have a toilet? No. What condition? You know. So I think for me, the one is the indicators of quality, and two,
Right.
the actual data in terms of quality. So for water is easy, but for sanitation, I think many cities, utilities struggle with that. But I know Moasa is on this call and also comment.
Yeah.
I don't know also if my colleague Mariama Sanya is here. She could also comment in French and on the experience with owners on these measurements of indicators on quality of service provided.
Absolutely. Mowansa, do you want to comment?
Yes,
That's
sure.
okay for now.
Yeah, I think I'll give comment for I think what Dr. Najib has said. I think for now we can still proceed, but I kind of agree with him, not to say much, but yeah, I'll follow through and I'll give feedback. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Mitra.
Sure. I just request the host to enable chat feature right now so that we also have the chat flowing in. Mariam, would you be able to open up the chat as well, like enable the chat? So yeah, thank you so much.
It's active now, Mitra. Thank you.
Great. So, and just keep the comments flowing in on the chat box, and Mitra, feel free to facilitate this as as the chat questions are coming in as well, or comments are coming in, and I'll continue. So just say Deepa, hey, and just go ahead and feel free to weigh in. I think so. Building off of that context in terms of what we're missing now, I think one of the biggest things that I think, and the recognition of which actually inspired much of the principles and the language in citywide inclusive sanitation, is the need to shift the conversation from infrastructure planning to service planning. Because it does two very important things. Firstly, it says its infrastructure is only one input, an important input, but only one input into planning. And we should focus on really service levels and like service quality, right? Who is accessing the service and what is the quality of service we're providing? And if you look at other services, for example, like we wouldn't compromise on those questions when we think about the sort of SIM card we purchase or the broadband service we purchase, right? So the same principle should technically apply in the context of water and sanitation as well. And the question is, how do we do that well? How do we support, encourage, incentivize, particularly a public sector or a publicly mandated way of thinking about this? Because I think, and that is at the heart of it. So there are a couple of things. First, infrastructure is only one input into planning. There are other levers as well. Second, we should ask ourselves hard questions about who has access to the service and who does not, and then think backwards to think about what interventions we will want to design to change that. Because when we shift that conversation from infrastructure planning to service planning, the questions we will ask and the data we will collect itself would look very different, right? You would start with questions like, today, who has access to a service? This could be who has access to safe containment, who has access to emptying, who has access to potentially, a quality sort of public toilet. So you would start by asking who has access to that service and how does it change for low-income households versus non-low-income households? How much are they paying today, right, to access that service? How is this service, who is providing this service, right? Is it today mandated by the public sector? And I think the opening lines of the CWIS approach says that it's a public sector approach or a public sector service driven approach, which simply means whether the private sector provides the service or the government provides the service is a secondary question actually, but it always has to be formally mandated by government, because you're not going to be able to organize and ensure that the welfare benefits that are necessary and relevant to public goods. And I think sanitation is all the qualities of a public good, even though it has been traditionally considered otherwise, are made available. So you ask questions like, who is providing this service? Is it the public sector? Is it the private sector? Is the private sector regulated, or is it the unregulated private sector? And what is the cost of providing this service? So, and if you go back and look at 8 out of 10 city sanitation plans, you will see that we cannot find answers to these questions, right? And the first principles of citywide inclusive sanitation is if you cannot answer these questions well, then you're never going to be able to develop a good plan. And when we shift away from just thinking about infrastructure and infrastructure planning to service delivery planning, I think a number of new levers beyond infra become available to us to advance these service goals. I'm going to actually walk the audience because this slide I think is particularly important for all of us to come to terms with the number of ways in which we can shift who gets access to the service, at what cost, and what is the quality of service that we can guarantee or assure by thinking about a lot of different levers. First is revenue model, right? There are so many, even in a existing, without making any incremental infrastructure investments, even within an existing construct, you can make changes, right? You can shape demand behaviors and you can target supply in ways by simply changing who is paying who, right? For instance, on the revenue model side, what are all the different levers that one has? And this is an illustrative list. I'm sure if we all put our heads together, we can come up with many more boxes. But we have tariffs. So we have the major sort of revenue sources and what I would call sort of like the non-tax revenues, right? In terms of licenses, fees, and you have tax revenues, you have tariffs, you have levies, surcharges. You have so many different ways in which one can generate income. And by being imaginative about those levers, you can change how the ecosystem operates or how it's set up. Tariff modality, how is the tariff structured and charged? Are you doing a lump sum tariff or a volumetric tariff? Can change things. How much is being paid by which customer, for instance, can also have a huge impact on demand, right? For instance, how are you structuring the tariff? Can you cross-subsidize the poor more efficiently by charging a higher tariff of institutional and other commercial stakeholders, or even the non-low-income households? I guess that targeting might be more difficult, but even the institutional and commercial stakeholders, and what is the extent of that cross-subsidy through differential tariff is also an important lever. And how much is charged by which service provider for what services, again, is an opportunity for you to change a lot. And you will see, as I know I'm still talking about this within a theoretical construct here, but as we start playing with the platform, and which has all of these levers built into it today, we will see how making changes in these different levers can actually change so much in terms of service outcomes and quality. You can change the business models, and there are so many ways in which you can change business models, and you can issue a policy statement that suddenly makes certain types of investments in certain kinds of infrastructure by the private sector more attractive. You could have technology, and I think, for example, in Kampala, they are actively exploring how to replicate or use the pit vacs that this particular enterprise called Pit Vidura has been using in Kigali, Rwanda, and they're exploring how that can help empty, like actually changing how households are emptied or what equipment is being used to empty. Can that fundamentally create a new opportunity for maybe manual emptiers or gulpers who are already operating within that market to embrace that and start delivering a service using that new technology? You could do very specific sorts of incentives. You could do vouchers to the private service provider. Here, this could be a gulper or a emptier, or it could be a voucher directly to the households to trigger demand and to expand the pool of demand. You can also change market structures. For example, you could decide when you are as a government, for instance, procuring the private sector operator, you could say, I'm going to organize my city into 5 jurisdictions, and I'm going to promote competition between a small pool of suppliers in each of those jurisdictions. And that is how I'm going to structure my procurement. So competition and how you organize competition, I think all of these have a big impact on who gets covered at what price and what quality of services are provided. All of these levers have impacts on those outcomes. So all of those options or opportunities are now available on business model. Hardware, even within hardware, right? Often we think only at a very high level between, okay, I'm going to do traditional sewers or simplified sewers, or at the most now we're just talking about on-site system upgrades. I think there is a lot more opportunity even within hardware, right? You can change, for example, how you are going to phase or how you're going to make the investments over a period of time. You can decide if you want to build new infrastructure or expand existing infrastructure or upgrade or refurbish existing infrastructure. On capital assets, you can play with how the capital assets are organized, owned, and delivered, right? For instance, you can own the asset or lease the asset, and that has implications on financing. You can either buy brand new trucks or you can refurbish old trucks, for example. Economies of scale is a really important thing, for instance, right? For example, if a city already has 100 kilometers of network, can you increase densification? Can you get more households to connect to that infrastructure if they're not already connected? Therefore, building in economies of scale and building in cost efficiencies. Can you promote shared utilization of existing assets? And this is, of course, most commonly seen in terms of treatment, where we're constantly promoting co-treatment to improve utilization. And you can play with assumptions of useful life, right? For instance, certain assets probably have a much longer useful life, even in the same category, and therefore are more value for money. And thinking about useful life assumptions can also help think about making technology choices. Under efficiency, we can actually look at optimizing costs, even within the existing structure, through a number of levers, and we'll get to that in a minute. We can improve capacity utilization of existing assets by either promoting demand and making sure that, for example, if there already is an asset that is underutilized, we will want interventions to improve, for example, the collection efficiency so that there is more critical mass of waste and there is greater or more effective utilization of the assets. Or for the same cost, you can try and think about interventions or opportunities to improve service quality. And in hardware, there are a number of other levers, by the way. For example, there are a lot of, even within hardware, how do you think about the planning costs and how do you build in? And those are some of the things, for instance, we don't take into consideration as we think about the overall planning component of a city standard. Like what is it going to take me to manage or oversee these assets so that they're functioning well, for instance, or what is it going to take me, and I'll come to that in regulatory costs, to regulate these assets well, and what is that going to cost, and how do I build all of that into the model? And I think these are all levers that play into service quality and access, and often don't get considered. Financing is also an important lever, right? On financing, you can play with so many, again, different levers. For instance, what is the cost of finance overall, right? Which is it a 6% concessional loan from AFTB? Is it a 10% loan? What are the terms? And by terms, we mean, for example, when do you have to start repaying on that? And how does that impact your operational cash flows? And I know that there are lots of engineers here, and some of these terms around financing is new. We're happy to take time out to clarify. For instance, it's one thing to say, overall, I'm going to spend $12 million borrowing for this asset, and that includes my interest charges. But year on year, what implication that has on my cash flow is a different conversation, right? Because it's one thing to say this is the overall cost, but I need to structure it in a way with the financing agency so that I know that the money I'm making is good enough to repay what I owe them over a certain time period. You can also think about subsidy very interestingly. You can think about, what do you want to subsidize? What kind of assets or hardware do you want to subsidize? And how much do you want to subsidize it by? allocations. Do you want to think about supporting or intervening in the emptying segment of the market? Do you want to intervene or subsidize the treatment segment? Do you want to subsidize the containment segment of the market? Where do you believe where do we want to put the money so that there is the greatest impact in terms of, for example, overall safely managed sanitation, or in terms of the number of households that are benefiting from that intervention? So thinking about where we want to put the money in is also an important lever. And we can think about all of this somewhat conjunctively as well. And also contribution by service providers, right? Which is, if you look at in the simplest terms, if it's equity, debt, and grant, debt is a loan, equity is private capital or risk or public sector capital, that's risk capital. That's an investment that you make into the asset or the enterprise. And then you have grants, which is essentially, as you know, doesn't come with any terms or interests and is sort of really free money, but can subsidize certain public goods or components of the asset. So how do you structure the equity, debt, and grant portion such that overall you're building a viable portfolio also becomes an important lever? And one can think about all of these even within the existing context. Regulation is an incredibly powerful lever, because how are you going to regulate and in a manner where you are protecting the customer, you're protecting the environment, and you're creating a level playing field which attracts private sector capital, are often three of the most important considerations that shape markets in general, and that's also true for sanitation. So how you think about rules, sanctions, who you're going to monitor and control, and how you're going to shape competition through regulatory levers has a huge impact. So, for example, even without making any infrastructure investment in a resource constrained, in a small town that, for example, doesn't have a ton of capex money, just through efficient regulation, for example, of different segments of the market, and by being innovative about what kind of business models you promote, you can change service coverage and quality. And there are some really good examples of that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll pause here again. This slide is really important because the goal of this slide is to talk about all of the different possibilities in terms of interventions that we could play around with, right? In the event, right? And I think this is an interesting intellectual exercise for all of us. If we sat back and said, okay, this is a small town. They only have, they have 50,000 people. These 50,000 people have only so much ability to pay. So the revenue base is limited and it's constrained by what exists within that particular town or city or a small town. And there's only so much capital allocation that they have access to through transfers. How will I improve the quality of sanitation in the city, right? What would be all the innovative levers that I would use to really get the city to go from X to Y? And I think when you start thinking about that, you will start thinking beyond infra. And I think that's really important. And I think this is a way to provide a reference for us to spark our imagination and to start getting us to think along those lines. Again, I'll pause here and happy to get, totally feel free. Any comments or any thoughts are welcome before I go to the next slide. You can also tell me this is getting really boring. Can we shift gears?
No, please, far from it. It is far from being boring. What we just see is that in order to advance towards the best sanitation practices, we need enabling environment. And this is where we are having many challenges, because sometimes policy are there, but no financing. Business model are there, but no revenue. Financing is there, but no regulation.
Right.
As you're saying, it is really a mix and combined matrix that will help us get there. But meantime, these are all the aspects that needs to be ticked to be able to make that enabling environment. We are following.
Awesome. And now I'll quickly, and I realize that I've actually taken more time than I was hoping to, but jump into SAP. So this was the conversation, right, Malik? Right, like you're absolutely right. You don't have to tick all of the boxes, but you have to think intelligently about a combination of boxes within that larger matrix that can help us move from X to Y, given the political economy and the financial considerations or constraints within that particular city context, right? And that is really why we set up and developed SAP. Now, SAP is a online digital tool that is designed to help shift this conversation, right, towards service delivery planning and spark conversations on inclusive service models. I'll illustrate today what a platform like SAP can do first here, and we'll do an interactive demo tomorrow. So let's look at a hypothetical city. We're going to call it SIM. It's located along there are a set of seasonal rivers that go through it. The water table, therefore, is moderate. But like a lot of cities, it has a concentrated high density core, and you see a fair bit of urban sprawl, which spreads across the periphery. It has about 350,000 people. The population is growing at 5%. 30% of the people living in this town are poor, and the 70% are not. And there is increasing migration, which means that the growth rate is only going to go higher because it's a vibrant economic city. In terms of baseline, we see that this is reasonable roads. In fact, a lot of roads are above 3 meters wide. 55% of the population have access to piped water. 25% have CWIS today. It's about 132 kilometers of networks in the city, and 2% have simplified networks, and 25% have traditional networks. We don't know the data, but we think 40% of the containments might be safe or lined pits or tanks. But from whatever baseline data that's been collected, we know only 50% or less than 50% of these systems are currently being serviced or are emptied. The mandate of the utility today is primarily linked only to providing sewerage services and treating the sewerage, the sewage, that's the wastewater that's coming from that system. They have recently embraced a mandate to also cover on-site sanitation systems, but today are not doing anything yet in the baseline. Even though the policy or the mandate has changed, they aren't yet doing actual things on the ground, and the on-site system is entirely managed by the private sector. So baseline, 132 kilometers of sewer networks. They have 2 wastewater treatment plants. They have FSTPs today, but they're not doing anything in terms of containment or emptying as a utility. And it's entirely managed by the private sector. In scenario 1, you have about 48 kilometers of sewer network that they are planning to add to the 132 kilometers that already exists. And they want to add 2 more wastewater treatment plants and 1 more FSTP because maybe the current 2 wastewater treatment plants are overutilized or they've maxed out on capacity and they actually need excess capacity. And they're targeting a concessional loan of about 12 million SIM dollars to actually achieve this. And by the way, this is very much modeled on real world plans, so it's not totally hypothetical. There is no real change in terms of the service model per se, beyond some of these infrastructure investments that they're considering. There is some change in coverage percentage. Mitra, I know the data is missing there, but can you quickly pipe in to tell us what is the anticipated change in scenario 1 in terms of coverage, safe coverage?
So the coverage moves from 42% in the baseline to 52%. So an additional 10% increase is there.
And I'll show you graphs that support that. Now, if you go back to the matrix that we looked at, the 2 boxes where I think they've spent the most time and where they've thought about is they've looked at some new investments and they are looking at additional sources of financing. And they've done some basic tariff analysis to say, okay, there is a water tariff that exists, a certain percentage of this is potentially available for sanitation, but they haven't done a proper viability analysis. And this is very, very common. And it's not rare at all. These are the only 2 levers that they've considered. Now, let's look at a slightly different situation. And then in the next slide, I'll show you how it all plays out in terms of impacts on service delivery quality. There is another scenario potentially that the same town can consider. And this has come from active modeling engagements with cities like Lusaka, Nakuru, Kampala, and others, where we've been able to negotiate and think about some of these alternatives. For instance, instead of adding 48 kilometers of sewer, they decide they're going to add 18 kilometers of traditional sewer and 20 kilometers of simplified sewer. They're going to add only one wastewater treatment plant and one FSTP, therefore. And they're doing two additional things. They are buying or purchasing mechanical desludging units that will operate as transfer trucks, for instance, and will specifically target specific neighborhoods that are low income, high density, where you see a lot of manual emptying. The rationale behind investing in that segment of the value chain for this particular utility is that because manual emptiers don't have the opportunity, it is very hard for them to dispose of the waste at a designated point because they don't operate trucks. These are manual emptiers. If we could incentivize the manual emptiers by giving them some sort of a tipping fee to come and deposit at the transfer trucks and have the transfer trucks pick up at designated points within these low-income neighborhoods when the manual emptiers, where the manual emptiers are performing their services, we're actually targeting it at the poor, and we are allowing for more safe disposal of a certain percentage of the waste. There is an investment that's going into improving, either constructing new systems or improving existing systems, where 50% are targeted at pits, which is again targeted at low-income neighborhoods, and 30% of those are existing septic tanks that are being refurbished or upgraded. And to do all of this, they are now targeting a concessional loan of about 10 million SIM dollars. In a system like this, what you're doing automatically is you are thinking more systematically about more of those boxes. You are thinking about a business model intervention, which is how do I encourage or incentivize more safe disposal by incentivizing. Of course, you're deciding to intervene in a very specific, the intervention is not directly with the households, but is with the emptiers, the private emptiers, and by regulating the transfer trucks, which is where the monitoring and control comes in. And by the way, this is just one example. We can keep iterating on this, and we'll do that tomorrow on the session. But you're also looking at some targeted subsidies that are targeted at pits in low-income neighborhoods. You are looking at a targeted subsidy to subsidize or to incentivize, or the money that's going to go as a tipping fee for the manual emptiers to come and dispose at a designated point where the transfer trucks can pick up the waste and have it disposed. So there are reforms and incentives that are pro-poor, additional subsidies that are being considered, and you're also exploring potentially other levers of regulation like monitoring and controlling that segment of the emptying market to try and see how it changes things. Now, this is what the SAP dashboard looks like. Don't let the, it's actually a pretty simple, intuitive chart. I will start from the leftmost corner and move to my right. So in this chart on the leftmost, so first you have the baseline scenario, scenario 1, where or the hardware investment, which is 2, where you're only investing in a system of a network of sewers, and you're building a fecal sludge treatment plant, and you're building a wastewater treatment plant. And the third, where you're also exploring other levers. In scenario 1, let's start. We've divided up the ecosystem into 4 asset categories. You have sewers, non-conventional sewers, safe containment, and what we call unsafe containment. As you can see, this chart here, the blue is low income and the red is non-low income households. If you can see, most of the population in the city are in this large bar right at the bottom, which is unsafe containment. So the simple goal for the city as they're thinking about their sanitation plans is to move as many people from this large bar into one of these 3 bars, right? It doesn't matter to me where they go here, as long as it's viable and optimal and feasible from an engineering perspective. But the goal is to ideally bring this down to 0, right? That is the goal of sanitation planning. Right now, 42% of the total services are safely managed. And if you see, a bulk of the low income, which is the blue today, have unsafe containment. About about almost 7% of the population, the poor population, are the only ones that have access safe today. If you look at this scenario where you are going, which is the second scenario, and I will show you, what you're essentially doing is you are increasing, which is you're lowering this bar by 10%, and you are moving people from this bar largely into this bar, because a bulk of the investments that are coming are in the form of sewer investments. So 10% of the people, and again, because it's a sewer investment and there is an inclination to invest it in locations where there is enough road width, this is automatically going into those neighborhoods or households that are non-low income. So the 10% reduction here has come largely from the red, not the blue, which means it's the non-low income households that have moved from this bar to this bar on top. The actual status or the access to service for the poor remains unchanged. There is only a small 0.5% increase in terms of simplified sewers. So which means from the baseline to the new system, even though your overall coverage has gone up by 10%, most of this benefit is accrued to the non-low income households, number one. And number two, the number of poor households has only increased marginally from the 6.5 to about 7% in this scenario. And you are doing it at a cost of $38 million. Now, let me explain this. All of you might say, Deepa, you said $12 million is the concessional loan. Where is this $38 million coming from? This $38 million is the total cost to the government from this investment, because while 12 million is what it costs for constructing the asset, there is an operational subsidy that is built into your sewer tariff. Because what you're actually charging the people for the sewers on the sewer tariff, or what you're recovering as a markup on your water bill, does not meet the expense of maintaining these systems, which means there is an operational subsidy that's built into it. So another $26 million, and this is over a lifespan of 10 years, is what this particular utility is going to be spending to just increase the safe coverage from 42% to 52%. And much of this operational subsidy is going to the non-poor. It's not going to the poor. And the tragedy is, these are not hypothetical completely. This is based on reality. This is what we have seen in several cities where we've deployed SAPs. We've seen regressive subsidies. We've seen utilities taking on expensive loans without targeting the benefits of those loans towards the poor, and taking expensive loans to only marginally increase safe coverage for a small percentage of the population. Now let's look at scenario 3, which is again here we've made certain assumptions. And please note that this is not to support a particular service model, but just to spark our imagination about all the possibilities or all the things we could be doing differently when we think about sanitation planning. Here we are overall, because there is only a small increase in sewer and the operational subsidies that continue to exist for sewers, which contributes to an additional $2 million over and above the 12 million, it kind of remains the same. But I think what you're doing is the total increase now from the baseline is 29%. You're increasing safe coverage to 29%, and you're doing it at a net incremental expenditure or a public expenditure of $14 million to the utility. And here, if you look at this bar that is shortened from both of these bars, 17% of the poor are moving from unsafe to safe containment. And that is the shift you've managed to achieve here, moving the overall safe coverage, but at a much lower impact on the government in terms of total public expenditure. And you've achieved this primarily because you have not just depended entirely on infrastructure investments, but you're also improving the quality of regulation. You are beginning to regulate the emptying market in scenario 3, while nothing changes in scenario 2. And which goes to show that unless you can change regulation and market structures to be more responsive to creating a competitive, but at the same time, an environment where customers' interests are protected, you're not going to change the needle in terms of service access or quality. If you look at the public expenditure, we've talked about this a little bit. In the earlier scenario, a lot of it was focused primarily on CWIS, and the benefits largely accrued to the non-low income. But here you see that you're balancing that a little bit more by distributing the investments or the public investments that are being made between the poor and the non-poor more efficiently. So these are the first three elements. We talked about how the poor versus the non-poor benefit from these investments. What is changing in terms of the quality or the market structure itself in terms of regulated versus unregulated markets? And how much are they spending? How much is the government spending, which is an important equity proxy between the low income and the non-low income households? So you see where your public investment is going, who it is really benefiting, or whose lives it's changing. Another important proxy that we track on SAP is, I'm really sorry, I realized I'm 2 minutes over time. I will take 3 more minutes and close. But another important thing we see in SAP is how does it change the price that the households are paying? For example, here in this particular scenarios, there are no interventions that are directly impacting price because we're not changing competition or increasing the number of new operators that are going to be competing for the same market. So, or we're not changing any fundamental supply side factors on the technology side to make it more cost competitive. So you see that the actual price that households pay itself does not change in any of these scenarios. But here is an example that is also a lever, for example, that we can change and play with as we're thinking about, okay, do I want to make the market more affordable? And is that something that's important to me? Then that also becomes an option. But one thing that's important or pertinent to note that today the low income households are paying substantially more to the unregulated private sector market, even when compared to the CWIS tariffs, right? So, or and that's something that's really important to notice and register. And that's something that we see traditionally and something that one needs to fix. In terms of the government costs, right? Like, and which is something, again, that's a lever that we can control. This is something we talked about already, and I'm happy to go into the details, but what we try and cover is the sustainability angle to the government, both in terms of overall, what is the cost to government? Because when we talk about cost to government, we can't just talk about the one-off capex, but we also should talk about the operational costs and build that into the total government costs. And we also capture the profit versus the losses and the revenue to cost ratio, which is sort of really a very useful way to think about operating capital risks that the utility is taking on. As you notice, we're going from a deficit of 42 to 56 in the second scenario. You're still in a deficit. You're still running an additional $3 million deficit in scenario 3. But you're achieving a lot more safe coverage for a lower deficit in comparison with scenario 2. And one of the things we'll explore when we do the live demo tomorrow is to see how can we change this? If I want to go from a loss-making utility to a utility that is not making a loss, what levers are available and how can I change that? And finally, water, right? And such an important factor and variable that we often don't take into consideration and something that requires more conversation. A lot of the times, the sewer investments that are being considered are often being considered in water-stressed areas, and that itself as a consideration is not taken into factor when thinking about some of the feasibility or long-term sustainability. As you can see, we are, consuming or shifting safe coverage with a much lower water footprint in scenario 3 as against scenario 2, and something that today SAP as a model allows us to actively analyze and simulate.